Hello and welcome to Mr. Gunn's A Few Slides On, what I hope will be part of a series of presentations. I may mean to make them a bit shorter and hopefully a little bit sweeter. This first presentation is on deontology. So a quick Google search on deontology shows us a lot of interesting and useful pieces of information, and of course some useless pieces of information. First thing is, we can see that deontology is a theory of ethics, and we can see that deontology is about rights and wrongs. And then we get a bit more detail here. Deontology is described as principle-based ethics. All of these that I'm highlighting are correct. And here we go, perhaps even more useful. Morality is a matter of duty. Deontology comes from the Greek word meaning duty-based or rule-based, and a deontologist believes that an action is right or wrong based on reason established prior to the event of the moral choice. This picture is interesting here because you can see that some find it useful to think of deontological ethics as in opposition to traditional utilitarianism. Utilitarians think that the end justifies the means of a situation, so good consequences means good choice or good action, but a deontologist excludes that kind of information. The end does not justify the means. In fact, they're not consequentialist, or as a student of mine said this week, they may be considered anti-Machiavellian, a term that I hadn't heard before, but I think is really well used, especially seeing as so many people seem to misuse the term Machiavellian in everyday speech. The good-looking chap represented in these pictures then is Immanuel Kant. His dates are 1724 to 1804, and his most famous work include Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals and the Critique of Practical Reason. Some interesting facts about Kant include his letter to his own friends asking them to stop inviting him out for dinner because he had too much important work to do for the world. The fact that he taught at university and had lots of students, even from when he was relatively young. The fact that he acted like he was required to stay on time for everything, and the villagers where he lived in Königsberg said that he was like clockwork and doing the same things every day. One of the pieces of context that I think is useful to Kant is to think about the fact that he was raised in a strict Christian household, and that's useful because later when you consider whether or not all human beings are born with an inbuilt moral sense, you might wonder about whether or not that was more prominent in Kant's life due to his upbringing, and it's a possible evaluative remark you might make, and it's a piece of context that you could interweave into your essay subtly but importantly. Here we go then. Here's a boy genius from the film Good Will Hunting, and you can see him organising some visual images there, and I've chosen it as to help us here because it reminds me of Kant working in university from a young age, and it also reminds me of his relationship with David Hume. Now, David Hume is credited with awaking Kant from a metaphysical slumber. That's what Kant said about him. Hume's work was important to Kant because they disagreed over knowledge and they disagreed over ethics. Hume was an atheist and Kant believed in God, and Hume argued that reason is a slave to passions, and he decided this because he'd studied many forms of ethics around the world in different cultures, and he had learnt that, in his view, there was no one unifying system for ethics around the world, and in fact that all desire to be moral comes from passion, which here stands in for sentiments, feelings and emotions. In fact, for those of you who are interested, Hume actually argued that sympathy was the main driver for humans' desire to be moral, and if Hume were around after Darwin, it seems likely that Hume would have accepted a largely evolutionary or Darwinian explanation for morality and for ethics. Now, in Hume's work, he had proposed that there could only be two forms of knowledge. This is on Hume's fork, and he proposed that there was a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge, and that a priori knowledge is tautologically verifiable. That means it's verifiable through an analysis of the definitions within. So a bachelor is an unmarried man. If we think about the word bachelor, we can unpack that into unmarried plus man to make the entirety of the term. So it's a necessary definition, or rather a sufficient definition. With a posteriori, we get what is largely the world of science or empiricism or sense verification. So it's any statement that you can go and check in the world to be true, such as the sun will rise or it's raining. Every time someone says to you, it's raining, you've got to check. You've got to look out the window, you've got to use your eyes, or you've got to listen for the rain. And that means that you are checking a posteriori. So Hume would have agreed that there are and therefore can be no moral facts, as a moral statement such as it is wrong to lie, or it's good to tell the truth, or it's wrong to murder, can never be verified, can never be checked, can never be knowable a priori or a posteriori. And we know that this was displayed on Hume's fork, which has two prongs on it, the priori and the posteriori prong, and we know that Kant disagreed with the idea that there were only two forms of knowledge, as he said that moral statements are in fact verifiable as they are, and this is the basis of his theory, or the starting point, his epistemological basis, and perhaps a first key feature, which is that Kant believed that moral statements were verifiable through synthetic a priori reasoning. For Kant, then, this meant that a moral statement such as it is wrong to lie was true a priori, which means independent of experience, so before experiencing the world, it's true that it's wrong to lie, but synthetic, which is not analytically or necessarily true. But in his mind, it's still true prior to experience, and he would have justified that by arguing that human beings are capable of reasoning what is right and wrong prior to the consequences of an action being produced. Therefore, and as I've said, perhaps a good first key feature, Kant's view is that there are moral facts which are true synthetic a priori. Here we see then Kant, I'm going to get to the categorical imperative in just a moment, but here I thought it was interesting to see the two different distinctions between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. Now, Kant liked the categorical kind and he disliked the hypothetical kind, and that's because, if I talk about the hypothetical kind for a moment, those are an imperative, that is a statement that you're going to do something, but a hypothetical one is one that rests upon some notion in the future. So I will tell the truth if it makes other people happy. If it's got an if in, then it's dependent on the future, it's dependent on other people, it's potentially using other people, and so it's wrong. Same with if it's got a but, always tell the truth, but, or unless, and all of these for Kant means that the imperative, the desire to do something, or the motive with a hypothetical imperative, the motive is highly questionable. Kant therefore favours the categorical imperatives. Now these are absolutes, independent of time and space. They're based on duty, the word Dion, you'll remember, and and they are not dependent on consequences, but rather they are based on the absolute desire to do good, or the goodwill. As Kant says, a goodwill is not good because of what it affects or accomplishes. It is good through its willing alone, that is, good in itself. Or two things fill me with ever-increasing awe and wonder: the starry skies above me, and the moral law within me. The reason for Kant's attention to the goodwill is because he argued that the goodwill was the highest task for any human being. He argued that the only thing in the world that is good without qualification is the goodwill. In this case, he means it as good intentions. For example, intelligence, happiness, love, all of those can be bad in certain situations or certain qualifications. And the only thing that is good without qualification in all circumstances, according to Kant, was the goodwill. So when we face a moral dilemma, such as whether to give money to charity, Hume would have argued that the motivation to give to charity would come from a feeling of sympathy, and that's where all moral feelings and sentiments come from. So if somebody decides to give, then that can be good, depending on the cultural expectations and society's norms over whether or not that's deemed to be a good act. But it ultimately, the reasoning to desire to give to people comes from a feeling of sympathy, and so it's emotional. And Kant would have seen it slightly differently. Now this donation picture has a glass in it, which is interesting because Kant would have said that if you are giving to somebody purely because of emotion, then it's not necessarily that much different to acting animalistic in another way. So we don't credit ourselves when we feel thirsty and have a drink. So why, when we feel like helping someone and we just follow our feelings, should we feel so good about it? No, for Kant, if you gave to somebody because you felt like you should, that doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. It doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing either, but it's not morally worthy unless it comes from something that Kant would have called a maxim, the desire to do a good thing that you give to yourself, and you should give yourself that maxim because of reason. So giving to charity might be a good thing, giving to someone who needs it might be a good thing, but if it's purely driven by an emotional sense, then it's not as good as if it's the product of reasoning and thinking. It's an interesting proposition if you think about it as a human being. Sometimes overriding the emotional desire can clearly produce more moral responses or moral actions. For example, if somebody is thirsty, extremely thirsty, but they give water to someone else who they think needs it even more, the body is saying that it needs a drink and the mind is reasoning. And it seems that sometimes the height of moral action can be when people control the emotional, animalistic side of oneself. Remember that Kant said that when we act with pure reason, we're acting, oh dear, look at that, what a state, there we go. We're acting like, more like angels and gods, which are part of the noumenal realm, the realm independent of experience and consequences in the world. Perhaps the most essential, well-known key feature for Kant is the categorical imperative. Now, Kant's view was that moral rules and principles that most people seem to agree with, or that we have a strong moral sense about, are derived from a single absolute imperative. So thou shalt not kill comes from the categorical imperative, and his aim was to make that categorical imperative explicit. He says the categorical imperative would be one which represented an action as objectively necessary in itself without reference to any other purpose, or as that was said earlier, anti-Machiavellian, anti-consequentialist, deontological, duty-based, rule-based, absolutist, etc. And on the next slide we're going to see the separate formulations of the categorical imperative. It can be confusing because in different textbooks and different explanations, you can become muddled as to how many formulations of the categorical imperative there are. I wouldn't worry too much about this. I'm used to dealing with 3 versions of the categorical imperative, and I'm going to point them out on this slide to you now. So the first one, live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law. So this involves, prior to consequences, thinking about the universalization of your actions. And because of this universalization, you can draw parallels to some of John Stuart Mill's utilitarian thinking, even though the theories are in conflict with one another. And that's analysing, because what we're doing there is extracting the single or a prominent similarity. And we know that we analyse when we talk about singular features or aspects of a theory one step at a time. Live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law is the formula of the law of nature and the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Okay, the second formulation is written down here in the phrasing, always recognise that individuals are ends, and do not use them as means to your end. Don't say the dinner was lovely when it tasted terrible, so that you cheer someone up and manipulating them to feel a certain way. Don't tell a student that their essay wasn't very good, when really it was great, just to motivate them. This is one of the formulations of the categorical imperative that is particularly demanding, because I think in common sense morality, people do find it acceptable to, for example, tell misleading truths, or to factor in how other people feel into their own decision making. But Kant says that we should never take an action that would then change the reality for someone else. This is the formula of the end in itself. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Interestingly, this adds yourself into the situation there. A strength of Kantism is illustrated here as everyone, all human beings in Kant here, are emphasised as holy and important. This adds the idea of equality to Kant's theory, irrespective of race, class, etc. So this one we can consider number 2. And the third formulation is best thought of as the product of the 2 before. And I'm going to see where I have some space for this now. There we go, just about managed to find a spot for it up there. Sorry about that. But the third formulation combines aspects of the first 2, which is the formula of the kingdom of ends. Act as if you were, through your maxims, a law-making member of a kingdom of ends. This is Kant's ideological, perhaps, view on the world, which is that each member acts as a law-making legislator for themselves, using rational thoughts to only decide one's own actions. That is, to be completely autonomous. An opportunity for another strength here is that many Christians find this agreeable with Matthew 22:39, love your neighbour as yourself. Okay, a pure coincidence that both of these ideas come from the Holocaust, but something to think about with Kantism. In this scene in Schindler's List, we have the girl in the red coat, and the girl in the red coat is an important point in the film of Schindler's List. If you don't know it, then what you'll find happens is that Oskar Schindler is a businessman who's profiting off the Holocaust and the death of the Jews, and he has a moment where he feels extremely emotional over the death of a girl in a red coat. And at this point in the movie, it's when he decides to actually start to help the Jews and feel a great amount of sympathy. And you can actually mention that in your essay, because you could say, you don't need to explain the whole situation, but what you could say is that perhaps it's an example of moral feeling. The feeling of sympathy actually can make people do good things, and perhaps Kant overlooks that slightly, or perhaps his theory doesn't consider about how sometimes having good feelings is the prompt towards people becoming a good person, and shouldn't just be dismissed because it is feeling based rather than rationality based. The other image is from the heroine film Sophie's Choice, and I think it's an interesting one because in a moral dilemma, as a moral philosophy teacher, if you don't know the situation, in this movie, a mother is asked to choose between her two children and she can only save one. And it's interesting that as a moral philosophy teacher we might ask this situation, what should she do? And a utilitarian would argue if she can lose two or save one, she should save one, or she ought to save one. Whereas Kant's contribution here is to actually say that if she doesn't choose, she might not be completely responsible because she doesn't have what he would call true moral autonomy. Because true moral autonomy requires freedom from coercion. And as the victim here is being forced, or people in concentration camps, people in various situations, awful situations that we give to you in moral philosophy classes all the time, Kant would perhaps say that we need to have true freedom to be reasonable or to make the right choices, and also to be morally responsible for the choices we make. So I find it interesting to examine Kant's view on a situation such as Sophie's Choice. Bit of attention here now for a famous quote that might be useful for you to use in your essays. Kant said, "Goodwill shines forth like a precious jewel." And you remember that goodwill was what he said was the only thing good without qualification. And I do find it interesting the way that philosophy invades different parts of the world and the media. I was watching this with my 2-year-old son, Kate and Mim, and you can't tell me here, watch this clip, see how, for sure, one of the writers studied Kantism and Deontology when they wrote this part of the script. But you be the judge.
Don't worry, Agnes. Sometimes thoughts shine brighter than the most precious jewels.
Okay, so some other key features in Kantism that I won't be able to go into in detail because I'm trying to keep these much shorter, but I think will be important to list and think about, and you would have to be able to explain a bit more about these if you were to use them in an A-level essay. So make sure you revise as well the summum bonum, or total happiness, and Kant felt that we must not seek happiness directly or perfection directly, but rather work on individuals to make themselves worthy of happiness. Kant considered that we have morals inherent within us, and that we could work using a priori synthetic reasoning to improve ourselves with an aim of reaching the summum bonum, and that all of humanity could only do that when they work as autonomous agents. The next key idea that might be worth considering is that Kant felt that God would underwrite the whole of his theory. You see, Kant felt that we all had a moral law within us, which is something that, particularly if you study psychology, you'll be able to examine in your essay. Vardy says that Kant largely reduces religion to ethics. To be holy is to be moral. And as is always the case, you can argue that this might alienate non-believers as a negative, or involve religious people, which you might think is a positive. Kant did say as well that Jesus was a perfect exemplar of the morally good life. I've grouped three key famous thinkers together, which are Kierkegaard, Marx, and Eichmann. Bit much to call Eichmann a key thinker, actually. He's not. He's a Nazi. But a famous case of someone, as with Kierkegaard and Marx, perhaps isolating some aspects of Kantism rather than the theory in its original form. And so you can investigate each of these three to see how Kantism can be obscured or adjusted and become something extremely different. Eichmann, a Nazi that committed terrible deeds, and in his trial, which you can read the transcript of his trial online, said that he was only following orders, and he had clearly studied a little of Kantism to justify his rationality for just following orders or duty. But it's largely considered that he abused Kant's theory, especially because Kant said that the rules we must, in order to be moral, we must place the rules on ourselves. So yes, it is following duty, but not just doing what we're told. Next, we should think about some modern contributors. There are many questions that you could be asked on Kantism or deontology. But one of the key features is of the mark scheme is that for the level 4 grade boundary, you may need to refer to a modern contributor. And the most common modern contributor mentioned to Kantism is W.D. Ross, whose work is on prima facie duties, which are first glance duties, and you can find explanations of this in a number of textbooks and philosophy textbooks. But I think the easiest way to think about it is that Ross provides a follower of deontology with a clear guide or some suggestions about what to do when duties conflict. If I promise you that I'll meet you for lunch at 1 o'clock, then it's important that I'll meet you. I keep that promise. But if I'm on the way there and I see somebody drowning, I should break that promise to save the person that's drowning. So his argument is that some duties seem like duties at first glance, but then actually need to be reordered according to the importance of the situation. So he's essentially arguing that when duties conflict, we may need to decide what to do from within a given situation. Another key thinker is James Rachels, and James Rachels considers Kantian ethics at great length, and we'll study James Rachels in our final unit. Is a very demanding moral thinker who considers whether or not we should overlook even personal relationships in order to be truly moral, and whether or not that's a true moral ideal fitting with deontological reasoning. And all we need to do is make sure that when we study Kantism, we consider all these key features, a bit about Kantian context. The categorical imperative is a must to know inside out, some key quotations, and that we also know some more of the work. I haven't explained it enough here, but we will have to do so. That the modern contributors are Ross and Rachel. They don't follow Kantism exactly as it is. They both make their own contributions. That's why they're important to talk about, and important to talk about contemporary versions and ideas on the theory, what bits have been taken on, what bits have been adjusted. All we need is some really clever way to remember that it's Ross and Rachel's. Ross and Rachel's. How are we going to remember that? Just need a fancy way to remember Ross and Rachel's. Now, I collected some questions from some students I've been teaching, and I'm going to try to answer some of these. Did Kant live by his deontology, and did he campaign to enforce it on a larger scale? He certainly campaigned as a key thinker of his lifetime, and one of the major voices of Western philosophy. Now, did he live by his deontology? I think he's known for living a quiet life, and I'm sure that he made attempts to make it a moral life. I don't believe he ever married, but I have found an article in The Guardian that says that Kant had some wild years. He published his work when he was quite old, And this says, and I'm quoting here from some 3 biographies written on Kant, and this is an article in The Guardian. Kant is traditionally portrayed as someone who led a mechanical life. This is the picture of the old Kant, but if you look at the young Kant, you find a very social type who partied and drunk too much, with a sense of humour, and sometimes he was, let's see, it says that he was thinking about getting a wife, but he thought about it a bit too late. There we go. This question asks for other main deontologists. I've mentioned some others in the video already, but we can say that Kant is definitely the most famous deontologist. Also, Thomas Nagel was a deontologist. Thomas Nagel, you remember from, he wrote What's It Like to Be a Bat, with a great song that accompanies it that you can find on YouTube. What's it like to be a bat? Oh, if only I knew that. I could probably explain all the problems of the brain if I only knew what it was like to be a bat, or something like that. To know more about inclinations, when Kant used the word inclination, he just meant something that we felt like doing rather than something that was derived from reason. So know more about inclinations. That would have included emotion, desires, feelings, feeling of sympathy, feeling of thirst, feeling sleepy. All of these things are inclinations. They come and go, and they're a product of the physical world, and so they are not moral. This question says, how is the hypothetical imperative relevant to deontological theory? It's relevant because Kant explains why hypothetical imperatives are poor. And when he explains why hypothetical imperatives are poor, he's attacking consequentialist teleological, or more relativist theories, subjective theories as well. So we're talking about what he's not in this instance. He is not someone that favours hypothetical imperatives, because when you do that, you can move from that point into the categorical imperative. So if I were talking about hypothetical imperatives, it would be a brief section of a paragraph before the extensive categorical imperative sections. Next question asked to consider criticisms of Kantian ethics. The main criticisms come from utilitarians, John Stuart Mill, for example, or virtue ethicists such as Alistair MacIntyre, who says that Kantism fails because it argues that human beings have an agreed sense of goals and morality, and he would disagree with that. But some other criticisms of Kant might be, you could say that it's speciesist, as Kant treats human beings with a particular kind of reverence. So he argues that human beings can access the world of angels and gods through reason, and that animals cannot. And you can disagree with that for a number of different counts, such as disagreeing with transcendent realities or disagreeing with preferential treatment of human beings. I believe Kant didn't have a particular issue with the abuses of animals, for example. And you could make that argument using the work of preference utilitarian Peter Singer, who argues that animals with preferences can and should factor into all moral decision making. You can say that it is inflexible, or that overlooking the emotional side of human beings makes them seem he just seems to desire robotic-like human beings, or that his theory is too ideological. You can mention the invention of lying as showing that human beings, when they are never lie, become less like human beings, or that the world that it would create wouldn't actually be desirable. This question here, what are the opposing views of deontology? Kantism, definitely the main field is utilitarianism, although virtue ethics presents something unique, but the most contrasting is all different forms of utilitarianism. We will recap some of those other stages. I might try and do more resources to help you there. This question, modern contributors and critics, already covered that. P.S. Do you lift? Yeah, an odd question that. There's always someone that likes to ask a funny one, but I did spend some time thinking about this question. Do you lift? Which I think is like a question that people who lift big weights ask one another. But I think it's weird because it could be kind of insulting. Do you lift? I mean, if you have to tell people you lift, you're probably not lifting enough, are you? Anyway. Okay, well that's it. I hope you found that useful, and as always, good luck with revision or anything else you're doing.